Reb Simcha was a simple man, but unfortunately the times were against him. He had lost all his money and he had nothing to be able to provide to his family. So he was driven to his last resort. He went to the landowner of the region he lived in and he said, "Look, everyone knows that you have a property at the end of your border that's been unoccupied for years now. I'd like to try my hand at being an innkeeper. If you could provide me with some money to buy whiskey and vodka, I can get started, and that way I'll make a living and you can have a tenant." The landowner, knowing full well that this property has been unoccupied for about 10 years, jumped on the deal. He said, "For sure, whatever you need." He gave him the money and sent him on his way. So Reb Simcha moved with his family out to the outskirts of the region, and he lived in this inn. Unfortunately, they weren't doing so well. He wasn't able to pay back the landowner, and he wasn't doing so well. They're just barely scraping by. Until one day, the Baal Shem came to town and stayed at this inn. As soon as he walked in, Reb Simcha scrambled together to get whatever food they could get. He managed to pull together a half-decent meal for the Rebbe. And before the Baal Shem sat down to eat his meal, he looked at Reb Simcha and he says, "You know, when I was coming in, I seemed to have dropped my snuff box somewhere in the forest. Do you think you could take my horse and go and find it for me?" "Of course," Reb Simcha replied, "I'd be happy to." He immediately got on the horse and went out into the forest. He was looking to the left, to the right, under the bushes, around the trees, but he couldn't find anything. When all of a sudden, he heard a yell come from deeper into the forest. So immediately he rode out there and found that a carriage had fallen into this mud and was sinking deeper and deeper. And the person inside was in terrible condition. So he tied a rope around the horse and around the carriage and managed to pull it out. But the person was still in bad condition. So he took him all the way back to the inn, and immediately everyone jumped into action. They made a fire, they took the meal that was for the Baal Shem Tov, gave it to him, and they prepared a bed for him. The next day, this person, thank God, was okay. And turns out, this was the prince of the whole region. So the prince looked at Reb Simcha and says, "You know, you saved my life. I wouldn't be here if not for you. Please, as a simple token of my appreciation, take this money." And he handed him 2,000 rubles. Reb Simcha was shocked, but he says, "No, I can't. You have to understand, it was a simple act of humanity. Anyone in my position would have done it." And he gave the money back. So the prince looked around the inn and he saw broken window shutters, doors hanging from single hinges. The children were wearing tattered clothes. And he says, "Look, it's a small token of my appreciation. Please accept it." And he handed him 10,000 rubles. Reb Simcha was in shock, and he looked at the Baal Shem Tov, who just shook his head and said no. So Reb Simcha pushed the money back as soon as it was laid on the table, and he said, "No, I can't accept it." And the prince was in shock. He didn't know what to do. So he says, "Look, at the very least, let me write down your name in my ledger. Let me keep a record of this." So he said, "Okay." And the prince went on his way. Soon after that, the Baal Shem Tov left as well, having no more business to do there. And Reb Simcha's wife looked at him and says, "Are you stupid? He just handed you money. All our problems would be solved with this money. And you just let him go? You just gave it back like that?" Before Reb Simcha could respond to the rebuke, a man stuttered into the inn and said, "1 glass of whiskey, please." Reb Simcha's wife looked at him and says, "We have no more whiskey left." He says, "Look, pour some water into the barrel, shake it around, and see if we could get something together." So she did, and she served it to this farmer, this simple Gentile farmer. And he said, "This is delicious. This is the best whiskey I've ever had. I'll have another." So she did it again. And the man loved it. He says, "This is incredible. I've never had something like this. I have to tell all my friends." The next few days were great. People were rushing in and out. The inn was never so busy. And all of a sudden, Simcha found himself doing very well monetarily. However, it all turned when 2 businessmen came into the inn one day. And that night, there was a big scuffle. And all of a sudden, the one man ran outside and started yelling, "He's dead. The innkeeper has killed my friend and taken his money." And before anyone could say anything, Reb Simcha was taken to jail and questioned. And they found him guilty. They said, "Sure enough, the man is dead and the money is gone. It must be the innkeeper." So Reb Simcha was sitting there in jail. He's thinking, "Hashem, how could this be? I'm a good person. I didn't do it. I've only done what you asked. I follow the laws. I don't understand. This can't be the case. I know you'll turn things around for me." And he sat there and started reading Tehillim. And before you know it, a key came into the lock and the door opened. And he says, "Sir, you're free to go." And he said, "What happened?" He said, "Look, all I know is that all the cases that go to execution have to go before the king." Turns out this king was the same prince that had visited Simcha years before. And when the case came before his desk, he looked at the name, he says, "Simcha, I offered this man 10,000 rubles when he had nothing, and he refused it. Now you're telling me that he's killed someone to take his money when his business, his inn, is doing just fine? Doesn't make sense. Go look into this man, the other party, and see what's the deal." And so they did, and sure enough, they found that this partner had killed his business partner and taken his money. And Reb Simcha was let to go home to be with his family, and sure enough, his business continued to prosper. Shavua Tov.